Hi, I'm Darrin Peppard. Welcome to the Leaning into Leadership podcast, the podcast dedicated to today's hardworking leader. Join me every Sunday for leadership insight, inspiration, and a little pep talk to keep you rolling down your road to awesome. Hey everybody, welcome back into the Leaning into Leadership podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Darrin Peppard. And this week on the podcast, I have a guest whose story I think you probably have already heard. You just don't necessarily know the name Coach Jim Johnson. In 2006, Coach Johnson put a player into the game late in the senior night game. And that young man, a kid who has come to affectionately be known as J-Mac, poured 20 points in a matter of less than 4 minutes. He became a viral sensation, an ESPY winner, and it's one of the most powerful stories that I've ever heard. I'm certain that you'll remember the story when you hear Coach talk about it. But there's so much more than just that one story to Coach Johnson. He has transitioned from being an award-winning, fantastic high school basketball coach to being an award-winning, fantastic speaker in the leadership space. I'm super excited to share Coach Johnson with you. But before we get to that, I just want to remind you that we're at that time of year when setting up professional development for our coming school year is starting to come to the front of our mind. A couple of things that I would love to work with you and your schools on would be high performance leadership teams, which is a wonderful 2-day intensive workshop designed to help get your leadership team all on the same page, firing on all cylinders and ready to take on the upcoming year. The second would be having the opportunity to come and speak at your school, to work with your entire staff, to work with your students, to build that sense of belonging, that sense of pride, that sense of love in the school that all comes from developing a positive culture and climate. Check out everything available at roadtoawesome.net. There's some great stuff there, folks, and I'd love to work with you. Just reach out, shoot me an email, or send me a direct message on social media. All of that contact information is in the show notes. But with that, I want to jump into this conversation with Coach Johnson. There were so many incredible pieces in here, so many amazing nuggets of knowledge and of leadership. I hope you enjoy. All right, Jim, thank you so much for joining me here on the Leaning into Leadership podcast. I've really been looking forward to this conversation, and I'm really excited to share you and some of your story with my listeners.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it, Darrin. Look forward to being with you.
Outstanding. So you and I obviously just connected here fairly recently, and right. I'm really grateful that we had that opportunity to, because definitely there are a number of things that you and I have in common in our background. Certainly some differences, but a lot of people who have never been a coach wouldn't necessarily make the connection between coaching and leadership. But to me, they're very seamless. And you know, there's a tremendous amount of leadership that goes into coaching. And there's a lot of coaching that goes into leadership. So I'm excited to have this conversation with you today. But before we do that, maybe for my listeners who don't know who you are, maybe just tell them a little bit of your background, a little bit of your origin story, and yep. what has brought you to what you're doing now.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to address one thing, then I'll give you just a quick background, is that
sure.
I will say this, that when I started to become a student of leadership, it was a very interesting correlation that how my teams got so much better. So because early in my career, I was all about, okay, how can we win basketball games? I was a high school basketball coach for over 3 decades. And when I realized it was really more important to understand how to be a good leader and how to build team and build team dynamics, is that when I figured that out, I had quite a bit more success. So I just wanted to share that because, as you mentioned, coaching and leadership are, and I've spoken to businesses all over the country about leadership, and there's a lot of similarities. There's certainly differences in some things, but leadership, the foundation of it is important, no matter if you lead a basketball team or a multi-billion-dollar company. With that said, Absolutely. I'll give you just background. As far as I grew up in a big family. I was the oldest of 6, and we were very sports oriented. My dad was was my high school basketball coach, and my mother was an elementary teacher. So I grew up in a background of education. And when I got into high school, I had played all kinds of sports, but basketball became my love. And I ended up playing for my dad for 3 years. And that was a real honor. And my senior year, I was a pretty good player in my mind anyways. I mean, I was an all-league player. I mean, I wasn't anything, but in my mind, my dream was I wanted to play in college and then end up, certainly I wanted to play in the NBA. Well, I got to college and I ended up playing 1 year at a school on their JVs. Back then, many years ago, a lot of colleges used to have both a varsity and JV, and not very often anymore. But so then I transferred. Actually, I was going to school in Pennsylvania. I'm from Rochester, New York. Transferred because I got a little homesick, and I went to a state school called Cortland, and I actually didn't make the team, which was a really humbling experience. I think it helped me immensely in my coaching career because, as I've told my players over my 3 decades of being a head coach, is that, I kind of hit all the different perspectives of players, in the sense that when I was in middle school, I was one of the last guys on the team. In fact, when I played middle school basketball, it was the first year they had ever had it. So it tells you I'm a little bit older. And they didn't have enough uniforms. And I actually had to wear a T-shirt with a number on it, which was kind of embarrassing. So, and I was at the end of the bench. My senior year in high school, I was the best player in the team. And then in college, I played 1 year, and then I actually got cut. So I really hit all the gamuts, from being the worst or one of the weaker players on the team to being the best player on the team. I've been kind of in the middle of the road, and I've also gotten cut. So I think that did help me immensely as a coach. Certainly I didn't realize that at the beginning. But then, when I got out of college, I was really wanted to get into education, and because basketball was my number one love, although I coached other sports, basketball was my dream. I wanted to be a head coach in my area. I lived in a suburb of Rochester, New York, and got an opportunity at 25 years old to be a head coach, which is pretty young in coaching basketball. And I had some success a couple of years as a junior varsity coach. And of course, in my mind, I'm thinking, I know what it takes to be a great coach. Yeah. I did such a great job the first year. I led this team to 17 consecutive losses. And then the administration told me something I didn't want to hear. They said, I think we're going to look for another teacher and coach. So I lost my position. Of course, that was a very humiliating situation. And but you know what? It ended up probably being one of the best things in my career, because at that time I was kind of this arrogant 25-year-old that thought he knew everything. And it really opened my eyes. And I'll give you one last thing. So the next thing in my blessing was the next year I actually worked for a junior college coach as an assistant. And little did I know, he was a very good coach. I learned a lot from him, but his name was Bill Van Gundy. And for those of your listeners that follow basketball at all, Bill is not famous, but his 2 sons are. His sons, Jeff and Stan, have both been head coaches in the NBA numerous times, and they're both now commentators. And interesting is that Jeff was younger than me, so he was a high school coach when I worked with his father, and his brother Stan was a college coach. So little did I know that they would end up doing that. But that was a real blessing, and something that I highly recommend as a leader, to get mentors like I was fortunate to have. But my dream was I wanted to get back in the high school level, and got an opportunity to go back. I coached in a small school for a couple of years, really enjoyed it because I was from a big town of about 100,000 people. But, my ultimate dream is I wanted to get back to my hometown called Greece, New York. And after a few years coaching this smaller school, I got an opportunity to come back and coach one of the schools in our town. When I grew up, there were 3 high schools, and there's actually 4 now. And I went to one of them, and I ended up being a head coach at one of the others. And that was probably my biggest challenge. I took over a program that was horrific. They won 2 games and lost 40 in the 2 previous seasons before we took
Ouch.
over. So we had a lot of work to do, but fortunately, I was there 7 years. In our last 3 years, we had 3 of the school's best years ever, and we ended up making the postseason tournament and made the semifinals of the tournament, which the school had never done once. We did it 3 years in a row, but we didn't break that barrier. And then I got an opportunity to move over to one of the other Greece schools that, for many reasons I'm not going to delve into, I just thought was the best position of my hometown. Yeah. And that's where I finished my career with 20 years. And I'll stop there. I mean, we can go into, I know, I was blessed to be part of an inspirational story. We might get into a little bit if you want, or we can go.
Yeah, definitely.
Direction. So,
yeah, no, we'll definitely touch on that story, because I think as you tell that story, the listeners are going to remember that and say, oh my gosh, you're the coach that put that player in the game. And we'll come back to that in a couple of minutes. And honestly, you and I could just talk basketball for hours, and
absolutely.
Isn't the Leaning Into Basketball, show. Maybe I'll start another podcast and you and I could just talk basketball, because obviously, that was something for me too. So a similarity there for the two of us, when I found that passion for education, and it wasn't right away. I mean, I started as a physical therapy major in college. I wanted to be the high school trainer. And this isn't exactly the best way to select your major, but I didn't really have that person, that guidance counselor. I mean, we had guidance counselors, but I went to a really large high school, and when it was, senior year was winding down, and I knew I was going to go to college, but I didn't know what I wanted to do. And I thought back to the time I had spent in the training room. And honestly, as a high school athlete, I was a really good tennis player, as a state champion tennis player. I was on the basketball team, but I spent more time in the training room, honestly, than I did on the floor. I was just injured all the time. And I'll never forget it. November 23rd, 1984. You may or may not know the day, but you'll remember the moment. Doug Flutie throws this unbelievable pass to beat Miami on the last play of the game. You know the game.
I did not know the date, but I remember it well. So.
Exactly. Well, I know the date because I had to look it up to talk about it in my book. But that I was in the training room, and I watched this happen. And so I'm deciding, hey, I'm gonna be the high school trainer, because he gets to be at all the games, work with kids, and he has a TV in his office. So that's actually why I chose to. But it didn't work out. But it was actually basketball that was my calling into education. A buddy of mine in college said, hey, come help me coach this basketball team. And I did, and I was hooked. And honestly, it was 5th grade girls. So it's not like we're doing a lot of heavy X's and O's, but being able to work with kids. And then like you, I had this desire. I wanted to be a head basketball coach. And I was able to achieve that as a head girls basketball coach, where I did my 11 years of teaching. So I get that, that passion that drives you, that pulls you there. And when we talk about leadership and we talk about coaching, again, there's so many connections. Yeah. I wonder if maybe there's, for you, 1 or 2 moments that you look back on your coaching career as kind of like defining leadership moments that, you reflect upon and maybe are, just some incredible gold nuggets that people need to hear.
Well, you know what? I mean, there's certainly, I could go in a few different directions with this, but I think it might be a good segue to kind of share the story that I was blessed to be part of, because there was a lot of life lessons in what happened. So let me share that, and I'll share some of the leadership issue or ideas that I really garnered from that. So the first thing is, so I had coached at this school I mentioned before called Greece Athena, and they had a losing season before we took over, but they had some tradition. They won a state championship. They had an NBA player that played there named John Wallace that played at Syracuse. And so they had some tradition, but they had stubbed their feet a little bit. But anyways, so when we took over, we got it going right away. We won in our first season. And I think my first 7 years, we had winning seasons. We won a couple division titles, but we were struggling in the postseason. We didn't even get back to the semifinals, like I mentioned at my previous school, where we made it 3 straight years, my last 3. And so I was really struggling with the idea, why can't we do it better in the postseason? Well, interesting enough, I think it was my 8th year. This young man comes into our program. His name is Jason McElwain. The world, if you follow the story, which I'll share in a little bit, we tagged him a nickname called J-Mac that I actually did give him the nickname because I couldn't pronounce his last name. So fortunately, he liked it, so it kind of stuck. That's what everybody started calling him. But anyways, Jason tried out for our JV team, and he was a little guy, and he's on the autism spectrum. And when he tried out for their JVs, he was probably 5'6", 90 pounds soaking wet. He was just a little guy. And after a couple of days of tryouts, my JV coach came to me and said, "Coach, we have this young man, Jason McElwain. He's not a very good player. He's on the autism spectrum. He's learning disabled, but man, this kid has a big heart. He loves basketball and he loves being around the team. I want to keep him in the program." So what do you got in mind? He says, "I'm going to offer him the team manager's job," which he did. And that year, there were some trials and tribulations because it was back in 2003-4. So back then, autism was starting to become a little bit more prevalent, but it was still a lot of questions. Still, there's questions today. And so we were just trying to figure him out, but we could see his passion, and it was just special. And so early on, after the kids got used to him, they really started, because our culture had been pretty good, so they kind of embraced him. And he would, in fact, it always warmed my heart because he wanted to sit on the bench for both the JV and the varsity game. But of course, because he was coming to the JV practices every day, he was closer to that group of kids. So during the JV game, he would get quite emotional, and he was so into the game. And as I kid people, after the game, he'd be what I call a tad disheveled. And it always warmed my heart because after the JV game, a varsity player would go over and he would straighten Jason's white shirt and black tie out, and he would sit on the varsity game. And he was a little bit more subdued for the varsity, at least as a sophomore. That did change. And so after his sophomore year, what was different about Jason, because in my 30 years as a head coach, I could probably count on one hand the number of young men, I coached boys basketball, that if they didn't make the team would try out again next year. And if they did, most of them would not make a commitment. They wouldn't come to our off season, but then at a lark, they may come out for the team, and most likely they didn't make it again. But what was unique about Jason was he loved the program and he wanted to be as good as he can. So after his sophomore year, he came to all our off season stuff, and I started picking him up. And because he was so passionate about basketball, and we really developed quite a bond. Well, he tries out his junior year, and I bring him in, and I said, "Jason, unfortunately, not quite good enough to make the team, but I would like to offer you the team manager's job." And Jason had really gotten into our program, and so at our first team meeting his junior year, he raises his hand. He says, "I said, yeah, Jason." He says, "Coach, we know you've never won a Section 5 championship, and we've decided we're going to stay by this slogan this year of staying focused, and we're going to help you do that." And interesting, awesome. Jason's sophomore year and the year before, we had actually gotten back to the semifinals. So we had gotten back a couple of years, but we still lost again. So Jason's junior year, we have a good season. We get to the semifinals now for the 6th time in my career, and we lose at the buzzer to our crosstown rival. So we're devastated. But again, what I admired about J-Mac is his resilience. He came again to everything. He tries out his senior year. And this time when I bring him in, I said, "Jason, I got some good news and some bad news." And he says, "Coach, tell me the bad news first." I said, "Well, unfortunately, you're not quite good enough to make the team." And this time you could tell he's devastated. I said, "But I do have some good news." His head popped back up and he goes, "Coach, what's your good news?" I said, "Well, I'm going to give you a uniform and hopefully get you into our final home game, which we called senior night." And he was pretty excited. And I kid people that periodically he would ask me about that uniform during the season. And of course, I defined periodically by Jason's standards about every other day. So he was pretty excited about that opportunity. Well, I wrote a book about it called "A Coach and a Miracle," because it's a kind of a long story that I'll just give you the abridged version. Is that at the beginning of the season, we're expected to have a really good team, Jason Senior. We had a lot coming back from the previous season. But after a couple games where we won an opening tournament, we had a really big incident occurred, and it's all in my book, but it's too long to get into. But I'll just share to the audience that it divided our team. And for anybody that's ever been on a team that didn't get along, then most likely you're not going to play to the capability that you could. Well, and that manifested because in the next 5 games, we lost 3 of them, and we were really struggling. And so you talk about leadership. I had to figure out, how was I going to turn this team around? Well, we went into this Christmas tournament, and the host school was the biggest school in our area, and they were really good that year. And in the opening round, we won in a close game. In the Fairport, as a high school, they beat this team by like 40 points in the second game that we had barely beaten 2 weeks earlier in overtime. So the next day, because it was during Christmas break, I brought the kids in for a short practice. We call it a shoot around. And normally at our shoot around, we would get out balls and do some shooting and go over some plays and get ready for the game. Well, I knew I had to do something different. So I didn't bring any basketballs out. I sat them in the stands, and I looked at them square in the eyes, and I shocked them. My statement was, guys, I don't want to go to the game tonight. And they looked at me like, what do you mean? And so then I shared with them, I said, unless we decide we're going to be a team, Fairport's going to beat us by 50 points tonight. And the best thing I did is I gave them a little motivational spiel for about 5 minutes. But then I said, guys, I don't have all the answers. I said, but if we don't open up and start sharing how we can unite this team, then we have no chance. And fortunately, they started to open up, and they started to share. And by the end of the meeting, you could see from their body language that they were starting to understand what it was going to take. And it manifested that night. We played a great game. We didn't beat Fairport. We lost them in overtime, but it showed that what we could do. And we got really gained some momentum. We won 8 out of our next 9 games going into senior night. Senior night was on February 15, 2006. And on February 13th, I gave J-Mac his first jersey. It was number 52. It was way too big. He didn't care. But there's a rumor going around school that he slept in it for 2 straight nights. But anyway,
it's probably more true than just rumor, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think there was some truth to that, to be honest with you. So anyways, so senior night comes, and for the people that are listening that don't know what a senior night is, basically before the game, the way we did it was we would bring the parents or guardians of all the seniors out, including Jason, because he was a senior, and then they would introduce their parents or guardians. And I just see his parents embrace him in uniform as a memory I will always cherish. It was really special. Well, the game goes on. And so at the start of the game, we had a good student body following. In fact, if people want to see on my website, coachjimjohnson.com, or if you go to YouTube, there's an ESPN video that's very powerful that I use in my presentations. But anyways, Jason, after 3 quarters of the game, we got everybody in but Jason. So with just over 4 minutes to go, because my dream was I wanted to get Jason with enough time so he could score a basket. I thought if he could score a basket, that's a memory he'll keep for the rest of his life. Yeah. So I put him in with just over 4 minutes to go. And the place just exploded. And what I didn't know and what Jason didn't know is one of our parents had made these pictures, these placards of Jason's face, and he put them on paint sticks, and he gave them to our student body, which they called themselves. And he said, if Jason gets in the game, show these. Well, when Jason enters the game for the first time, they give him a standing ovation, and they show all these pictures. Well, Mr. Macho, me, I get so overwhelmed with emotion. I sit down, and tears are literally rolling down my face. I cannot believe they greeted him. So he gets into his first game. In the first possession, he gets a 3-pointer from the corner. He lets it go. The crowd kind of stands in anticipation. It misses by like 6 feet. And I kid people that I know you're not supposed to pray in the public schools, but I was praying, dear God, please somehow help me get one. But, a great lesson for all of us is how many of us, when you do something new for the first time, because that was the first game Jason ever played in, and you do something that's embarrassing. In his case, he shot an air ball. How many just give up? Something to think about. Because Jason, one of the things we really talk to our players about in basketball, as you know, is a fast-paced game. We always talk about next play. You got to be ready to move on. You make mistakes, you got to move on. Well, Jason illustrated that very well. So he just shrugged it off. Actually, the next possession, he gets a shorter shot from about 10 feet. And this time it hits the rim. So I'm thinking, all right, God's starting to listen. We're getting closer.
Yeah. There you go.
Then
Getting warm.
And he shoots a 3-pointer again from the right wing. This time, magic. It goes in. The place explodes. And I'm thinking to myself, God must be a basketball fan. Jason, not only Jason scored, he's got a 3-pointer. It can't get any better than this, right? Well, before I close the end of the game, I got to share this. I'm going to fast forward very quickly. 5 months after that, Jason is in Los Angeles for the ESPY Award. He's up the greatest moment of the year, and his idol is Kobe Bryant. And ironically, Kobe is one of the other finalists because he had scored 81 points in an NBA game that year. So he actually meets his idol, and then he beats him out for the ESPY. So, and this is how he did it. In those 3 minutes, going back to the game, he starts making shot after shot. And the two things I'll never forget, with about a minute to go, at this point, he had made 4 or 5 baskets, and most of them were 3-pointers. I get a tap on my shoulder. I look behind me. It's Jason's mother. She's bawling her eyes out, and she whispers in my ear, Coach, this is the best gift you could have ever given my son. Of course, I cried harder. I was so touched. Then this is actually how the game ends, Darrin. I kid you not. It was like a Hollywood ending. Our opponent, Spencerport, that night, they score with about 10 seconds to go. And I want to give kudos to their coach and our players. They were great sports that night. But our player takes it out of bounds, and instead of throwing it to our point guard like he normally does, he threw it right to Jason. So J-Mac's dribbling on the court, and you see the clock ticking down, 7, 6. I'm thinking they're just going to let him go, and he'll go in and make a layup and end the game. Oh, no, he pulls up like 2 feet behind the arc, almost an NBA 3. I'm thinking, Jason, don't shoot from there. That's way too far. You're going to ruin the moment. He launches this rainbow. Swish. I look over, our student body runs on the floor, our players run on the floor, and the only thing I can think of is I'm living the movie Rudy, except this is really true.
Yeah.
And our parents or our players put Jason up on their shoulders. He's got the game ball over his head like this. And I have no idea how many points he has. And our public address announcer comes on and says the leading scorer for the Trojans tonight is J-Mac with 20 points. And of course, in my math brain, I'm thinking, if he'd have played the whole game, that's 160 because he scored 20 in So it was truly remarkable. And, but a couple of real quick little lessons, and then we can delve into some other things if you want. But is that, it was one of the, because we had been a divided team, and it was really nice to see us unite. But what warmed my heart even today, we just had the 16th year anniversary of that game, is that I had never asked the players on the court to pass Jason the ball. Yet in those last 4 minutes, they kept passing balls. He was the only one who shot. In fact, I still kid Jason because I still see him all the time. Jason, I'm still looking for your first assist. You never passed the ball once. It's that's really the essence of teamwork, when you can shine the light on another person. And then there's so many lessons we can go and we can delve into some. But the last thing I'll say for now is that Jason's what he wanted was us to win the Section 5 championship, and we ended up 3 weeks later, because now we started to get all this publicity, because actually I got even Jason's speech pathologist. He actually called the TV station the next day and asked about the video, because I felt I did it for the right reasons. We had no media there. I called the local newspaper just to call the game, and they didn't make much of a deal out of it. And although it was something I cherish, I didn't think anything of trying to promote it. But the speech pathologist called one of our TV stations, and when they showed it, within 3 days, we were getting calls from all over the world. It was just crazy. And of course, now we're going to go into our postseason tournament. And 3 weeks later, in front of a sold-out arena, we play an arena downtown for our championship game. And basketball, people love basketball, don't get me wrong, but it's not like Indiana where, you're selling out arenas. So normally for a championship game, and our arena seats about 10,000. We usually will get maybe 4,000 or 5,000 at a championship game. That night, because we were getting so much publicity, it was sold out. It was 10,000 people. And we ended up winning the game in a very close game. And why I want to share that is because one of the greatest lessons that I share was the fact that the greatest thing that happened in my coaching career, because fortunately Jason came back and helped me for my last 9 years. We ended up winning a number of championships together. So he is my good luck charm. I'll run him out to you guys. a small feat. But anyway, is the fact that, when people ask Jason, because he was interviewed often and I was too, and they would ask him, what was the best thing about your senior season, expecting him to share about his game. And he always says it was winning the Section 5 championship. And, when people ask me, what's the greatest thing about your career? And, I was fortunate we ended up winning 6 Section 5 championships in my last 11 years. And the greatest thing that happened in my coaching career was that game. I mean, there's nothing more special. And, people said, will you ever get tired about talking? And I don't think I ever will. It just touched me so deeply. And, so it's a great lesson as you're, leading different things, realize that sometimes there's really better things than even winning a championship, and just the ability to help other people it's something that's very special to me.
Well, I think there's so many great pieces in what you just talked about. First off, I mean, just from what you just said, I mean, really the true essence of what leadership is being able to help other people. And, when you're able to pour into someone like you did for JMac, and then to have, number one, to have that incredible moment, but, for him to just, be so humble and be so team oriented. I mean, you describe him truly as like the greatest teammate that the kids could ever have.
Right.
And, for his takeaway to be, no, we won the Section 5 championship. That's what it's all about. I mean,
right.
I think that's just amazing. But I want to go back to,
Sure.
I've heard you tell that story a couple of times now, and I think it's awesome. And folks, I do have down in the show notes, I have the link to the video, so you can go check it out yourself. I think it's definitely worth the watch.
Right.
But I want to go back to one of the leadership pieces in there that you hit it pretty well, but I think there's more there. When you talked about having a conversation with your team before you went and played in that game, and just telling your team, one, being vulnerable and honest with your team, I don't even want to go tonight, guys, and two, right, we have to come together as a team or we'll never reach the potential. Having coached one of those teams where something happened that divided, in my case, my 2 best players, you never achieve what that team could have achieved if you don't bring that team together. And I really appreciated what you had said there, and how you addressed them. Was there, I don't even know quite how to ask this question. Were you really intentional thinking that through for the course of the day? Was that kind of one of those, it just happened to work out perfectly? Tell me kind of about your leadership mindset as you were preparing for a shoot around where nobody was going to shoot a ball.
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. And my thought process, after that night, the night before, because I was like, oh my God, we are going to get annihilated.
Yeah.
What can I do? And I said, I thought all night. And when I got up early that morning before the shoot around, I was starting to, I always put a practice plan together. And I was like, you know what? There's nothing that we can do on the court that can help us right now. The only thing we can do is that I've got to share, like you said, vulnerable. I shared from my heart, but I got to get these guys to open up to each other and start to share some ideas. And because one of the best things that I really learned from, I started to do a better job, but that really changed my trajectory as a leader, is that I became a much better listener, and that I really became aggressive in the fact that I would reach out to kids a lot. We had a Monday captains meeting every week where I asked just simple questions like, how is the team chemistry? I would ask their input. What should we focus on this week? Who's hurting right now that we need to, help out, just kinds of things, and trying to get to know as much about each individual and just the culture of the team. Where are we? How can I best coach you guys? And it just helped immensely. And that was just a great learning experience that I think all leaders just got to be cognizant of. Is that too often we let our egos get in the way that we know all the answers, and you know what? Often we don't. It's the the people we work with. and so like I did a much better job. Like even in timeouts, I would sometimes just ask them a question: "What are you seeing out there?" Because I might be seeing one thing, but I'm not playing. So
Yeah.
and certainly, I mean, I coached a long time, so I think I have some wisdom to offer. But I think we often let our ego get in the way to think that we know all the answers. And I think the best leaders are people that have that growth mindset and they're open to suggestions. And like one of the things that I really shared with our players is I always want to hear from you. But I was upfront with them. I said, you know what, I'm not always going to agree with you, and if I don't agree with you, I'll tell you why. And you still might be happy with it, but at least they felt like they were being heard. And often I would take their suggestions if I thought it was beneficial to the team.
Yeah. But again, just a bunch of great leadership golden nuggets right there. I want to kind of take away from something that you just said there with, kind of how you evolved as a coach over time. And, I think about, not only evolving as a coach, evolving as a principal, as a superintendent. Definitely, I know there are things, if I could go back and tell myself, as a young coach, as a young school leader, hey, be aware of this or think about this. You hit a couple there, but what might be something that you, if you could go back, even if you go back to, the young 25-year-old who didn't last very long in that first varsity position.
Right.
I mean, what would be like a piece of advice that you would give yourself to, maybe prepare yourself better as a leader?
I think the best advice that I've learned that I implemented that helped me immensely as a leader, and it's something I challenge people a lot during my presentations, is I think you got to have clarity of who you are and what you stand for. So it's something I really push people to do is get, because in businesses, schools have it, they have their mission statement, right? And you know what? I mean, it's a powerful thing if you have a guiding light that people are all buying into. But where I see two issues, one is if, from a team, like we had a team mission statement was that we wanted to develop winners on and off the court. But everybody's got to know that. Just like, I've gone into businesses and they've got it up on the wall. And then sometimes I'll say to one of the employees, so what's your mission? And they'll kind of look at me like, I'm not sure, So
it's around here somewhere.
right.
Yeah.
So it's, so I think there's real clarity on what's your mission. And then, the old adage is that, you to be an effective leader, the first person, of course, you got to lead is yourself. And that's why I think it's so important that you have clarity about your own personal mission and what are your top values, your core values. So like when I talk to our players, when I really got clarity about my mission statement, which is to be an outstanding role model that makes a positive difference in the world by helping others make their dreams come true. And when I would, when I thought about that on a daily basis, I would get up and say, okay, I got to make sure I'm the example for people. That was very important to me. I've got to find ways to serve and add value to people today. And, how am I going to do that? So when I could answer those questions and try to put that into action on a daily basis, I became a way better leader. And then, I think our players, I mentioned that I always wanted to hear from them, but I also shared that, my three core values that we kind of build in our program. The first one is that I wanted everybody to respect each other. Okay, so respect, that we're going to respect all teammates, we're going to respect all opponents, we're going to respect the officials, and that's something we really strive on. Number two, I wanted people that were growth, that they wanted to get better. It is something that I really strive in my own personal life. Like one of the things I challenge people is, are you intentional about your personal growth? Like I am. One of my goals is I have to feed my mind a minimum of 75 minutes every single day. And I do that by reading. I listen to audio programs all the time when I go for a walk. I love podcasts. I listen to them in my car as well. I've turned that into a library on wheels. So I think there's just find ways to, to add value to yourself. So now you can add value, which the third one is for our team was called We Over Me. And that and I'm for my own personal core value is service to others. How am I going to help others and add value to others? And that was the similar concept with our team core value, which is we got to put the team first. what can we do to make this team better with everybody's individual talents?
Wow, that's awesome. I really appreciate that. So final question. It's the Leaning into Leadership podcast. So I ask this question of all of our guests. So Coach, right now, how are you leaning into leadership?
Well, I think the most important thing for me, because my brand right now that I've been working hard to build, is being an inspirational leader. So therefore, to do that, I said one of my core values that I have for both our team and for me is growing. So that I want to be a constant learner. I want to never stop learning, and I do that multiple ways. I mentioned a couple. The one, I have a couple mastermind groups that I talk to each month, that we bounce ideas off each other and help each other out, and just find is many ways. I was a big junkie on going to conferences and basketball world. Those were called clinics. I was always, in fact, one of my buddies that didn't retire, he's my age, and I actually had more wins when I retired than he did, but he stayed with it. He actually just got his 500th win. I just went over 400 when I retired. But one of the things a young coach talked to him and I one time, and we were probably 15 years older than him. And he goes, "We're never going to beat you guys." And we started laughing. I said, "Why is that?" He said, "Because every place I go that has something to do with basketball, you two are there." and so my point is that I think, to answer your question specifically, what I'm leaning in, I'm a student of leadership. I can't get enough of it. I'm always trying to find and learn from the best people, and then try to implement it into my life that's going to work for me. And I think that's another bit of advice, is that, because I know when I first got into coaching, the first couple of basketball clinics I went to, there were so many ideas. My head nearly blew up,
Oh,
and then you realize as you get a little more experience, you can't add all these things. What you got to do is figure out what are the good ideas that you can implement into your system, because there's so many good ideas out there, but they're not going to all work for you. Similar situation when I joined the National Speakers Association. The first conference I went over a decade ago, again, my head almost blew up, because I was just, there were so many ideas. But again, you got to go and decide, okay, what is my business model going to be? And then take the ideas that I can possibly implement. So in summing that all up, is I think whatever you're going to do, and in our case, talking about leadership, I think you got to be continually growing and be a student of leadership, that beginner's mindset every day.
I love it. I think that's awesome. And just another nugget for people to take away. So school leaders, what Coach just said, you go to a conference, there's a million different things. You don't have to go back and implement all of them, just way too frequently. And I know I did this as a coach and as a school leader. I didn't know there were 3 ways for me to run a 1-3-1. This is awesome. Let's try all 3. No, that's just going to screw up your team.
Right.
But as a school leader, don't try to implement everything you learn at a conference. I mean, if there are things exactly the way Coach said it, if there are things that you can implement into your system that are worthwhile, use them. But just because you saw it doesn't mean you have to use it. I really, really appreciate that, Coach. And I appreciate so much having you on the show. This was an amazing conversation. And I know without a question that our listeners are going to find just so much value in this conversation.
Thanks. I'll add one last thing, because you had such a powerful point there. I remember that, one year when I took over that small school, we were small, but we were quick. And so I wanted to learn how to press better. And that was not one of my strengths as a coach. And so I went to a clinic where Rick Pitino was there, and he had just taken over Providence College. And he shared in his clinic, but I didn't know enough. Now, this is how crazy I was. I actually connected with his staff, and I went and watched them practice for 3 days. And so, now I really understood, and then I, could implement not only what they were doing, but then add my own flavor. Because it's often, you go to a conference or a clinic and you get a couple of ideas, but if you don't know enough about it, you can really have your challenges. So make sure that, as you're a student of it, that you make sure that you really understand it so you can teach others.
Absolutely. That's also just a super powerful point. Yeah. If you just, take a little bit of it and try to throw it in, it's definitely going to fail. You're going to have to make sure you know it well before you put it into play. Thank you so much, Coach. I really appreciate it. Awesome conversation. Awesome to connect with you. Folks, if you want to connect with Coach Jim Johnson, all of his information is in the show notes. Reach out to him. Powerful speaker, incredible story, and an awesome guest on the Leaning into Leadership podcast.
Thanks, Darrin.
Man, that's just such a powerful episode, and so many great things that Coach Johnson talks about there. The thing that maybe I want to go back to from what he talked about during the podcast would be really two specific things. Number one would be that intentional work related to a divided team. So often as leaders, we get caught up and focused on the what we're doing, and we lose track of the who we are leading. And in that moment that Coach described, where he had to have that conversation with his team, it's one of those tough conversations that in leadership we have to have. And it's what really separates, I think, the good leaders from the great leaders. Being able to have the difficult conversation, to be upfront, honest, and vulnerable, and yet direct. That's an important skill in leadership, and I really appreciated how Coach talked about that and went a little bit deeper there. And the other thing that I want to loop back to was just him talking about being intentional about growth. You know, in the previous episode, I talked about all those other interviews where there were intentional pieces connected to leadership. And in Coach Johnson's case, it was that intentionality around his own and other individuals' growth. Such an important thing for us to remember, to always be intentional about the things that truly matter to us as leaders. And now it's time for a pep talk. I was standing off stage, thinking, pacing, couldn't wait to get out on stage for my first keynote. Hundreds of educators waiting to hear what I had to say. And I found myself frozen in that moment, wondering, man, did I make a mistake? Did I make a poor choice? Am I really ready for this? Yeah, it was one of those moments of imposter syndrome. We all have them, folks. Those moments where we pause and we sit back and think, do I really have what it takes to do this? Am I as good at this as I think I am? Or am I just worried that I'm going to be discovered to not necessarily be who I portray myself to be? Folks, it's normal. We all go through that. But here's the thing. When we're faced with those moments, when doubt creeps into our mind, we have to be willing to take a chance. We have to take a deep breath. We have to bury that fear down inside, put our foot down and say, hey, I am here because I belong here. I have earned my way into this place, whatever it might be, and I'm going to go for it. So if you're sitting, holding back, maybe waiting on submitting a proposal to speak at a conference, maybe you've been wanting to write a book, but you're afraid to reach out to a publisher. Maybe you want to take that risk and leap into that next role, that administration role or instructional coach role or whatever it is you're thinking you want to do. Folks, you got to be willing to take the leap. Bury that fear down inside, let it drive you, and just go for it. You owe that to yourself. The things that we always will regret are the things we didn't try. So that's how I address imposter syndrome. Put in the headphones, crank up some Eminem, and remind myself, I got this. So just get out there and go for it. Thank you so much for joining me this week on the Leaning into Leadership podcast. I hope you have a Road to Awesome week. Thank you for listening to the Leaning into Leadership podcast, brought to you by Road to Awesome. Don't forget, click subscribe, give a review, and share this with somebody who might also enjoy leaning into leadership.